Today we enter the haunting world of Cedar Ridge, but before we begin, I want to know, where are you watching this from, and are you ready to step into the darkness with me? You were never meant to hear this story, and if you keep listening, I can't promise you'll sleep tonight. In 1876, on a windswept stretch of Kansas prairie, 4 brothers survived a plague that should have killed them within hours, but what they became afterward was not human. Their shadows twisted against the light. Their voices carried notes the human ear should never register, and their eyes, God help the men who saw their eyes, shone like predators under a moonless sky. For nearly a century and a half, their names have been erased from every public record, not because no one believed, but because those who knew believed too much. 3 separate physicians refused to publish their findings, calling them a threat to the continuity of the human order. The Kansas State Medical Board sealed every scrap of documentation, locking it in a file they still refused to unseal. Even the church that once baptized them burned every mention of the family from its ledgers. You see, there's a pattern in history. The deeper you dig, the more you realize the most dangerous truths are not buried under time, but buried on purpose. And when they resurface, men vanish, families dissolve, institutions burn their own archives rather than let the knowledge spread. This is one of those truths. The Blackwood brothers, Ezra, Caleb, Josiah, and Abel, were not saints, nor were they monsters in the beginning. They were farmers, God-fearing, iron-willed, the kind of men who could stare down a blizzard and outlast it. But in the summer of 1876, when the first signs of the Harper County fever began to claim lives in less than a day, the brothers didn't just avoid the sickness. They drew it to themselves, invited it, drank from the same contaminated well, sat at the same deathbeds, and walked away untouched. The people called it divine protection. They were wrong. Protection was never the point, and transformation was. No medical text describes what followed because no medical authority will admit it happened. The final surviving report, buried under classification, contains a single line I've seen only once, copied by a trembling archivist who refused to tell me how he obtained it. It reads, "Subjects have transcended human biological classification," and then 3 heavy strokes of black ink. I need you to understand, once you know this, you can't unknow it. You'll start seeing the patterns they tried to erase. You'll recognize the fingerprints of the same suppression in other places, other times. But that awareness changes you. It marks you. And that's why they work so hard to keep you blind. Cedar Ridge, Kansas, wasn't much in those days. A handful of wheat farms, a single white-painted church with a bell tower, and a scattering of families who'd clawed their existence out of dirt and wind. The winters froze cattle standing up. The summers turned wheat to ash in a week. These were hard people forged in hardship, bound by faith, and yet something in that faith, something in the soil, something in the air, prepared the Blackwoods for what was coming. They lived apart from the town by choice, built their own limestone chapel on a hill overlooking their land, carved their own pews from walnut, inscribed Hebrew into their altar. Every Sunday morning, every evening, they worshipped without a preacher, claiming direct communion with God. And it's here you need to start asking yourself, direct communion with what exactly? Because when the fever came, when neighbors dropped within hours, the Blackwoods did not just endure, they changed. And when they stepped forward to help the dying, the epidemic's pattern shifted. Victims began to speak in voices they didn't own, in languages no one in Harper County recognized. Some began to mirror the Blackwoods themselves, right in it, down to the strange reflections in their eyes. This is where history stops talking, where the official story ends. But I'm not here to give you the official story. I'm here to give you the one that survived in whispers, the story that still makes certain doors slam shut if you try to open them, and tonight you and I are going to pry one of those doors open together before someone slams it on us for good. When the fever struck Cedar Ridge, it did not creep in. It arrived like a blade. One day the town laughed over wheat prices at the general store, and the next 3 bodies lay in shrouds before nightfall. No one could make sense of the speed. Typhoid doesn't move like that. It takes days, sometimes weeks to burn a man down. But this strain, if it was typhoid, was different. The fever climbed so fast the skin flushed to deep crimson within hours, then shifted to a waxen pallor before the heart stopped. The first to fall was Sarah Hartman, the shopkeeper's wife. She served coffee to her customers at dawn. By noon she was delirious, and before the stroke of midnight she was cold and stiff. But her husband swore that even after the doctor closed her eyes, they kept opening again, not in the normal twitch of the dying, but wide, aware, as if she was seeing something in the room that no one else could. The old German farmer Zimmerman followed. He'd been healthy enough that morning to split fence rails in the sun. By the afternoon he was muttering in words no one could translate, ancient guttural sounds that carried a weight, the kind of weight that makes you feel like the walls are listening. Then the Patterson twins, Emma and Ellen, both gone in the same minute, their voices locking into perfect unison, chanting prayers that twisted Latin into something unearthly. The doctor said the human throat wasn't built to make some of those sounds. He also said he wished he could forget hearing them. The town began to break. Doors were barred, shutters nailed shut. The Methodist church bell fell silent. Even the cattle seemed uneasy, stamping at nothing in the pastures. But through all of it, the Blackwoods stayed on their farm, isolated, watching. Until August the 10th. That night, Josiah, the scholarly one, claimed he had received a revelation. He told his brothers the sickness wableend as a test, not for the town, but for them. That God, or something speaking as God, had kept them untouched for a reason, to prove their worth by walking straight into the disease. The next morning, Josiah saddled his horse and rode into town. He didn't wear gloves. He didn't keep his distance. He walked straight into the blacksmith's home, where an 8-year-old boy lay thrashing with fever. Timothy Fletcher's skin was so hot it steamed in the cool morning air. His parents were weeping, praying, begging for a miracle. Josiah knelt beside the bed, laid his hands on the boy's head. But his prayer wasn't the one the Fletchers expected. His voice took on a rhythm that was not quite human, each syllable snapping like the crack of a whip. He asked, no, invited the sickness into himself, and everyone in that room swore the air grew heavier as he spoke. The boy's breathing slowed. His fever broke, and Josiah stood without a single bead of sweat on his brow. But there was something else, something that made the boy's mother clutch the crucifix around her neck and back away. Josiah's shadow didn't quite match his body. By that evening, the story had spread through every locked door in Cedar Ridge. Some called it a miracle, others witchcraft, but one thing was certain: the Blackwoods had stepped out of the margins of the town's fear and into its center. The next day, all 4 brothers arrived together, and that's when the pattern changed. When the 4 Blackwood brothers walked into Cedar Ridge together, it was like watching a storm roll in on a cloudless day. Ezra in front, tall and broad as a barn door. Caleb with his precise, calculating gaze. Josiah, the one who'd touched the boy and walked away untouched. And Abel, the youngest, eyes burning with that dangerous, unblinking faith that doesn't bend, doesn't question, doesn't forgive. They didn't ask permission. They didn't wait for the doctor's orders. They moved from house to house, stepping into rooms heavy with the stench of sickness. And wherever they went, the disease began to behave differently. People who had hours left suddenly lingered for days. Not in comfort. No, in something worse. They spoke more of that unknown language, in tones that made the healthy feel dizzy just to hear. Some began to weep without knowing why. Others laughed until their voices broke, and a few stared at the brothers with the kind of recognition that has no business crossing a stranger's face. Dr. Morrison, who had been tracking every symptom, began noticing patterns he couldn't explain. The victims touched by the brothers didn't just change physically, they changed mentally. Their eyes would track invisible shapes in the corners, their posture would mirror the Blackwoods unconsciously, and more than once he saw someone dying with their lips moving, silently repeating the brothers' prayers. But there was another layer. The healthy began to act differently too. Men who had once distrusted the Blackwoods now greeted them with a kind of cautious reverence. Women averted their eyes, not in fear, but as if in the presence of something sacred or profane they didn't dare to name. Children stopped crying when the brothers entered, even in homes where a parent was dying in the next room. It was as if the brothers carried their own weather, their own gravity, and anyone who lose enough began to bend toward it. By the third day, townspeople were inviting them in. Not the doctor, not the preacher, the brothers. Doors that had been bolted shut for fear of the fever now opened at the sound of their footsteps. Inside, they would sit for hours beside the sick, murmuring in low voices that made even the walls seem to lean in to listen. The results were unpredictable. Some people recovered entirely, as if the disease had been burned out of them. Others died faster, their last breaths escaping on a word no one could translate. And a small number, very small, walked out of their sick beds with eyes that reflected candlelight like glass. Dr. Morrison tried to warn the townsfolk. He said it wasn't medicine. He said healing shouldn't leave the healed. Changed. But the fear of the fever had been replaced with a new, deeper hunger. A hunger for whatever the Blackwoods carried. That hunger was the true infection. Within a week, even the healthy were coming to the chapel on the Blackwood farm, asking to be prayed over. No one quite knew why they wanted it, only that once they'd heard the brothers' voices up close, they couldn't shake the echo. And in the dead of night, from the prairie beyond Cedar Ridge, you could sometimes hear the brothers singing. 4 voices in perfect harmony, weaving chords that should not exist in human music. People said if you listened too long, you'd forget your own name. That was the week Cedar Ridge stopped being just a sick town. It became a changed town. It happened on the 12th day. By then, the brothers had touched nearly every home in Cedar Ridge. Some families swore they'd saved their loved ones. Others whispered that those who recovered weren't entirely the same. But no one was prepared for what happened in front of the old feed store. It was late afternoon, the hour when the sun drops low enough to cast the long, stretched shadows of the town's buildings across the dusty road. Ezra and Caleb had just stepped out of the Patterson home, their boots crunching on the dry earth. The light was sharp, almost metallic, the kind of prairie glare that makes you squint. People standing outside the store watched the brothers cross the street, and that's when they saw it. Ezra's shadow was wrong. It wasn't stretched like the others. It didn't bend with the contour of the ground or the angle of the sun. It stood upright, perfectly aligned with his body, like it was painted onto the air itself. Caleb's was the same, and when the two shadows passed over each other, they didn't blend the way shadows do. They resisted each other, like oil meeting water. Someone gasped. A boy dropped the bucket he'd been carrying and bolted behind his mother, but the brothers didn't flinch. Ezra turned, met the eyes of the crowd, and smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that says, "Yes, you saw it, and I am not afraid that you did." That should have been the moment the town turned on them, should have been the moment fear snapped people awake. But it didn't happen. Instead, something else took hold. It was as if the sight of the impossible only cemented the brothers' authority. The whispers that followed weren't about danger, they were about power. They're chosen. They're beyond harm. They're not like us, thank God. Later that night, the chapel on the hill was so crowded the doors couldn't be shut. People act lanterns, not to see, but to add their light to whatever it was the brothers were doing inside. Witnesses said the air shimmered when the brothers began their service. 4 voices, low at first, then rising in a slow, spiraling pattern that didn't follow any hymn anyone knew. Some people fell to their knees without meaning to. Others began weeping openly. A few stood with their heads tilted, eyes wide, like they were listening to something under the singing, something meant only for them. That was the night the town crossed a line. The fever had not claimed a single new life in 3 days. But Cedar Ridge wasn't safe. It was claimed. Even Dr. Morrison, who had tried so hard to resist, found himself on the chapel steps. He told me years later that he didn't remember walking there, didn't remember pushing through the crowd, only that when he finally met Ezra's eyes, he felt the weight of his own name vanish. Whatever the Blackwoods had become, it was no longer a question of sickness or health, it was a question of belonging. And in Cedar Ridge, you either belonged to the brothers or you were already gone. The shift was subtle at first. The chapel doors were still open on Sundays, and the brothers still walked into town like clockwork. But sometime in early September, the invitations began. Quiet knocks at midnight. A folded scrap of paper slipped under a door. No signature, just a single mark at the center. A black, hand-drawn cross, perfectly symmetrical. Those who received it didn't talk about it openly, not because they feared the brothers, but because they didn't want the others to know they'd been chosen. It was an unspoken law now. Whatever happened in the chapel after midnight belonged only to the ones inside. From the outside, you could see the lantern light moving across the windows, shadows passing in patterns too rhythmic to be casual. Some said they heard voices in there, speaking in that same layered harmony the brothers had used to heal the sick, but others swore it wasn't singing. It was instruction, low, deliberate phrases, repeated until they lodged in the listener's bones. The first thing people noticed about those who'd been invited was the calm. No more fear of the fever, no more doubt about the brothers. Even when their farms failed, even when winter threatened an early freeze, they stood straight and steady, eyes locked on some invisible point far ahead. They called it faith. Dr. Morrison called it conditioning. And here's the truth they would never write down. By this point, the brothers didn't need to touch you to change you. If you sat in their presence long enough, the shift began. It started in your voice, a subtle matching of their cadence. Then in your eyes, holding just a moment too long before blinking. Then in your sleep, when you'd wake from dreams you couldn't quite remember, with the sense that someone had been standing over your bed. Not everyone was invited. That was the key. Scarcity bred devotion. Men who'd once avoided the Björn. Others now found reasons to be near them, hoping to be noticed. Women walked the long path to the chapel just to accidentally pass them at prayer. It wasn't enough to be healed anymore. You had to be chosen. And once chosen, you were marked. Not in a way the eye could see, at least not at first, but in the way you carried yourself, in the stillness that followed you. Some swore they could tell just by the way someone's shadow moved, as if it had learned a different set of rules from the rest of the world. One man, Eli Thompson, tried to talk about it. He'd been invited, attended 3 of the midnight gatherings, and then stopped showing up. He told the storekeeper in a whisper that the brothers weren't praying in there. They were teaching, not from the Bible, at least not the Bible anyone in Cedar Ridge had read, but from something older, something written in symbols that bent in on themselves like knots of smoke. 3 days later, Eli's barn caught fire. The town said it was an accident, but when the flames died, his shadow was found burned into the scorched earth outside the ruins. No body, no bones, just that dark silhouette, curled in on itself like a man bracing against a wind no one else could feel. After that, no one questioned the brothers' methods. They didn't have to. By October, Cedar Ridge had split clean in 2, those who had been chosen for the midnight gatherings and everyone else. The fever was gone now, vanished as suddenly as it had arrived, but the divide it left behind was deeper than any sickness. The chosen no longer lived quite like the others. They worked their fields, tended their livestock, spoke to their neighbors. But there was an extra layer. The way they listened before answering a question, as if hearing something you couldn't. The way they tilted their heads slightly when looking at the horizon, as though they saw something moving there. More than one person reported catching them staring at places where no one stood. Doorways, fence lines, empty corners of rooms, and smiling faintly, as if greeting an old friend. That was when the first rumors began. Not about miracles, about sight. Mary Latham, a widow who lived on the north edge of town, told her sister that after the 3rd midnight gathering, she could see lights moving under the soil at night, like veins of fire running just below the roots of the wheat. She said the brothers had told her not to be afraid, that the lights had always been there, and now she was simply remembering them. Others spoke of hearing voices in the wind, voices that didn't speak in sentences but in raw meaning. Whole ideas dropped into the mind at once, like stones falling into still water. Dr. Morrison began keeping a separate set of notes, hidden, locked, written in a code only he understood. He saw enough of the chosen to know that whatever the brothers were passing on, it wasn't scripture. Some of the symbols he glimpsed in their hands, carved into small blocks of oak, matched nothing in any religious text he could find. They curved and twisted like they were meant to be read from more than one angle at a time, as if meaning could be folded. The most unsettling thing, his symbols were old, older than Hebrew, older than Sumerian. They belonged to something that came before language itself. One night, as frost crept over the prairie grass, Abel, the youngest Blackwood, stood in the chapel doorway and spoke to the gathered chosen. No one outside should have heard him, but 2 miles away, Eli Parker, who had not been chosen, woke from a dead sleep with Abel's words echoing perfectly in his mind, and though he didn't know the language, he knew exactly what they meant. The next morning, Eli packed a bag and walked to the chapel without being invited. He was seen going inside. He was never seen coming out. By now, the chapel windows were always dark during the day. The brothers didn't need daylight anymore. The chosen began to wear thin strips of black cloth tied around their right wrists, a signal no one explained, and more than once, a man would leave a gathering with both wrists bare, and by morning, his house would stand empty. The fever had been a test. This, whatever was happening now, was the real work, the shaping, the selection, the reordering of the town into something that belonged to the Blackwoods, and to whatever had claimed the Blackwoods themselves. And if you think this was just superstition, let me tell you what happened next, because it's the point where the changes in the chosen stopped being subtle. They started to bend the world. It was the first snow of the year, early, heavy, the kind that buries fence posts and turns the prairie into a blank sheet before winter's even begun. Most folks had shuttered themselves in, but a few were still moving through town, stocking up on coal, trading preserves, checking on neighbors. Among them was Ruth Miller, a quiet woman, never one for gossip, but lately she'd been marked with the black strip around her right wrist. She walked with the same calm all the chosen carried now, like nothing in the world could hurry her. She was standing outside the post office, speaking softly with Abel Blackwood when the wind came. Not a normal gust. This one bent the snow sideways, hard enough to strip shingles from roofs and slam doors against their frames. People ducked into buildings. The air went white. And in the middle of it, Ruth didn't move. She lifted her hand, not to shield her face, not to grab her coat, but in a slow, deliberate motion, palm out toward the wind, and the snow stopped. Not for everyone, just for her. The blizzard continued all around, battering windows, rattling signs, burying boots in drifts. But there was a perfect circle, no more than 10 feet across, where the air hung still and clear. Her hair didn't stir, her coat didn't ripple. Snow hit that invisible edge and slid off, like water sheeting over glass. The handful of people who saw it froze, not from the cold, but from knowing they'd witnessed something impossible. Abel leaned close to her, said something they couldn't hear, and then the circle spread. 10 feet became 20, 20 became 50, until half the main street stood in a strange, windless calm, while the rest of the town shivered in the storm. Someone, maybe out of awe, maybe out of fear, called her name. She turned her head toward the voice, and that's when every person inside the circle felt it, the pressure, a thick, heavy weight on the chest, like the air itself was leaning on them. They couldn't move, couldn't breathe quite right, couldn't look away. The circle collapsed an instant later, the blizzard swallowing them again. But by then, the damage was done. It wasn't faith anymore. It wasn't belief. The chosen could do things. By evening, the story had spread to every kitchen and hearth in Cedar Ridge, and though no one said it out loud, they all felt the same truth settle into their bones. The Blackwoods didn't just control the town, they were building something here, training people to reshape the world like clay. And if Ruth Miller could stop a storm in its tracks, what else could she stop? It was the last Sunday before Christmas when the brothers called the town together. No midnight knocks this time, no secret scraps of paper, just a bell, deep, steady, and wrong somehow, ringing from the chapel on the hill. The sound carried in a way bells don't. It didn't fade with distance. You could hear it in your teeth. Even the livestock grew restless, pacing the fence lines until someone gave up trying to hold them. By noon, every man, woman, and child in Cedar Ridge was standing in the frost-bitten grass outside the chapel. The chosen stood closest to the doors, black strips of cloth stark against their coats. The rest hung back, eyes darting between each other and the brothers, as if looking for permission to leave. None found it. Ezra stepped forward first. His voice didn't need to be loud. It carried anyway. "You've been spared," he said. "You've been healed, but you've not yet been made." Caleb joined him, holding something in his hands, a wooden box about the size of a Bible, carved with the same impossible symbols Dr. Morrison had been sketching in his hidden notes. Abel and Jonah flanked the chapel doors, silent, watching the crowd. Caleb opened the box. Inside, there was no object, no artifact, just darkness. Not the absence of light, but a black so deep it looked solid, like you could reach in and grab it. He turned the box toward the crowd. The temperature dropped instantly. Breath froze mid-air. The world went quiet. Not hushed, not muted. Gone. The sound of the wind, the shifting of boots in snow, even the bell's lingering hum. All of it was erased. People stood with their mouths open, gasping soundless gasps. Then, in that silence, the brothers spoke. Not in English, not in any language anyone recognized. But everyone understood. The words weren't heard, they were placed directly into the mind, like hot iron pressed to the skull. Choose now. Step forward and be shaped, or remain as you are, and be forgotten. The chosen moved first, stepping into a semicircle around the brothers. The rest of the town hesitated until the black in the box began to spread. It didn't pour out, it grew like a living shadow creeping across the snow. Anything it touched lost its color, then its texture, then its shape. An old man near the back stumbled as it reached his feet. Where his boot had been, there was only smooth, featureless white, as if his leg ended in nothing. He screamed silently and collapsed, half his body swallowed by the creeping dark before anyone could pull him back. That broke the crowd. Some ran, most stepped forward. Dr. Morrison told me years later that he stood frozen in that moment, not from fear, but from realization. The fever had been bait. The choosing, the midnight gatherings, the symbols, all of it had led to this. The brothers weren't just creating followers, they were creating extensions of themselves. When the blackness stopped, the semicircle had doubled in size. The brothers closed the box. Sound returned. The wind rushed in like a flood, and the people who'd stepped forward stood taller, calmer, their eyes faintly reflecting the winter sky, even though the sun had already gone down. From that day, there was no more joining the brothers. There was only belonging to them, or waiting for the dark to come again. Winter tightened its grip, but Cedar Ridge no longer feared storms or scarcity. The chosen didn't seem to feel the cold the same way. They worked barehanded in the snow, never shivering, never slowing. Food stores stayed full, tools never broke, and sickness never took root. But the quiet came with a cost. By January, word had reached the next town over, Millford, that travelers heading through Cedar Ridge weren't coming out the other side. At first it was chalked up to weather, then to bandits, but when a group of 4 hunters failed to return, Millford sent 2 men to investigate. They made it as far as the ridge before turning back, not because of what they saw, because of what they didn't. No wind, no bird calls, no creak of frozen branches, just a stillness so absolute it made their ears ring. They swore the air felt thick, as if something unseen was pressing against them. When they turned to leave, they realized their footprints behind them had already filled in, not with snow, but with a smooth, glassy surface, like ice poured in a single, perfect sheet. A week later, a merchant wagon from Dunlow disappeared on the road to Cedar Ridge. The driver's horse returned alone, mane braided with black cloth. Then came the first real proof. A letter, smuggled out of Cedar Ridge by a boy no one recognized, arrived in Millford. It was addressed simply, "To whoever still listens." The handwriting was jagged, uneven, as if written in a hurry, or with a shaking hand. It read, "They can see through the trees now. They know when you speak of them. The ones who are chosen can walk farther than they should. Roads bend for them. If they give you the cloth, don't take it. Don't look in the box. Don't. The writing stopped mid-sentence. The page was scorched at the edges, the burn lines curling inward as though something had eaten its way into the paper from the center. Millford. Posted armed men on the road after that, but it didn't matter. By February, people were disappearing from their town too, without ever setting foot near Cedar Ridge. Dr. Morrison noted the pattern. Every missing person had either spoken to someone from Cedar Ridge or taken something from them, a gift, a tool, even a loaf of bread. Contact was enough. That was when the whispers began about the reach, that the brothers had moved past the need for midnight gatherings or chapel walls, that the chosen could carry their influence like a seed, planting it in the minds of anyone they touched. And if that was true, then the dark wasn't just growing, it was spreading. It was late March when they came. 6 men in long coats, badges pinned under the lapels. Not locals, not county deputies either. Their boots and gear were too clean, their rifles too new. Word was they'd been sent from Topeka, though no one in Cedar Ridge ever saw the paperwork to prove it. They didn't ride in all at once. They approached on foot, 2 at a time, from 3 different roads. Precaution, they said later, in case the situation got messy. It didn't matter. The moment they stepped past the ridge, the sky shifted. Clouds that hadn't been there a heartbeat before rolled in fast and low, tinged faintly green, like a storm about to drop hail the size of fists. The first pair, the ones on the west road, vanished from sight in less than 100 yards. The other 2 pairs saw them simply dissolve. Not into shadow, not into light, just away. One step there, the next step nowhere. The remaining 4 kept going, though slower now, rifles raised. They reached the main street to find it empty. No sound but their own boots crunching frost. The snow underfoot was smooth, unbroken, except where they stepped, each print filling in almost immediately behind them, the ground flattening itself back to perfect stillness. Then a door opened. It was the chapel. All 4 brothers stood inside, but not in the same way a man stands in a doorway. They filled it. Their shapes were there, yes, but the space around them bent, like heat rising from asphalt. "Lawmen," Ezra said, the word a slow, deliberate thing. "We knew you'd come." One of the agents, older, hard-eyed, stepped forward. "You're under arrest," he said, voice steady, "for the disappearance of—" He didn't finish. The sound left his mouth but froze in midair, hanging between him and the brothers like a ripple in glass. Then it collapsed inward, into nothing. His lips kept moving, but no words emerged. Jonah smiled. "The law doesn't breathe here." One of the younger agents panicked, firing his rifle. The crack of the shot was swallowed before it could echo. The bullet stopped less than a foot from Abel's chest, hanging in the air like a bead of mercury. Abel plucked it from the air, turned it between his fingers, and handed it back. By the time the surviving 3 turned to run, the street was no longer a street. It bent away from them, curving back toward the chapel no matter which way they moved. One collapsed from exhaustion, another simply dropped out of sight, as if the earth had folded shut over him. Only one man made it back over the ridge, stumbling into Millford with frostbite on his hands and the whites of his eyes completely black. He spoke only once, days later, before his mind gave out entirely. "They let me go so I could tell you. We belong to them now, all of us." After that, no one came from Topeka or anywhere else. Cedar Ridge had been cut out of the map. By April, the thaw should have come, but in Cedar Ridge, winter lingered. The snow no longer melted, it just changed. What fell from the sky wasn't quite snow anymore. It was softer, slower to melt on skin, and when you looked closely, the flakes weren't random. They were patterned, each one marked with the same jagged symbols carved into the Blackwood's chapel doors. The town no longer smelled of wood smoke or horse manure. The air had taken on a faint metallic tang like rain on iron, and the light, God, the light, had gone strange. The sun rose and set where it pleased, sometimes sliding sideways across the horizon, sometimes dipping out entirely for days. Houses leaned subtly toward the chapel. Not from wind or rot, just a slow, impossible settling, as if the ground itself wanted to face the brothers. Fences warped, roads narrowed until they all led to the same place. The chosen no longer pretended to be ordinary. They moved with the same unhurried certainty as the brothers, their eyes catching bits of light that weren't there, their shadows sometimes lagging behind, like reluctant pets. And then came the animals. A farmer named Briggs woke to find his cattle standing perfectly still in the field, all facing the chapel. Their breath hung in the air, but none blinked, none moved. When he tried to lead them away, they followed for a few steps, and then drifted back, as if pulled by a rope he couldn't see. Even the land outside Cedar Ridge began to bend. Travelers passing miles away swore the hills didn't match the maps anymore. Forests shifted, paths doubling back on themselves until they spat you out where you started. Dr. Morrison wrote in his journal that this was the first stage of the shaping being done openly. The brothers no longer needed secrecy. They were sculpting Cedar Ridge, not just the people but the land, the weather, the rules, into something that belonged entirely to them. And then one night, the chapel bells rang without warning. Every chosen walked into the streets at once, barefoot despite the snow, and faced the hills. The sound rolled out across the plains, far past the ridge, past Millford, past any place where people still dared to speak the brothers' names. Those who heard it said the ground seemed to breathe. Those who answered it never came home. By summer, Cedar Ridge no longer looked like itself. The chapel was taller, not by construction, but by growth. Its steeple had lengthened like a bone, thin and sharp against a sky that never held the same color twice. The walls rippled in the heat, though there was no heat to speak of. The ground breathed now, not metaphorically. Every few minutes the soil would rise and fall in a slow, steady rhythm, like the town itself was inhaling. Wells ran deeper without digging, but the water tasted faintly of copper. The chosen had stopped speaking altogether. They didn't need to. They moved in perfect synchronicity, answering commands no one else could hear. When they passed each other in the street, their shadows merged for a moment before separating again, as if they were pieces of the same thing. One morning, Dr. Morrison woke to find his house on the wrong street. The number over his door hadn't changed, but the street around him had. Buildings rearranged, alleys shifted. He tried to walk back to where he thought his home should be, but the roads looped and folded until he returned to his front steps without meaning to. That was when he understood. Cedar Ridge wasn't a fixed place anymore. It was folding in on itself, shaping and reshaping like clay in invisible hands. The last outsiders to see it came in July, a group of 3 prospectors trying to cut through to the rail lines. They never made it to the main street. One turned back at the ridge, screaming about the sky moving wrong. The other 2 walked on, and the ground simply swallowed them, not with violence but with indifference, like water taking a stone. The brothers began appearing everywhere at once. You could see Ezra on the chapel steps, then turn a corner and find him leaning against a fence. Sometimes they were taller than they should be. Sometimes their faces were wrong, eyes too far apart, smiles too wide. By August, the land around Cedar Ridge had gone barren for miles, as if drained. Not dead, not dry, just empty. Even the wind avoided it. And then the hills shifted. From Millford, you could see them changing shape, drawing closer, closing like a fist. Roads vanished. Maps became useless. Cedar Ridge was no longer on the land. It was part of something bigger, something alive, something that had been waiting to wake up, and the brothers were its voice. It began with the bells again. No one in Millford heard them at first, not over the sound of their own lives, but the animals did. Dogs whined and crawled under porches, horses screamed in their stalls, birds erupted from the trees, wheeling west in a single black cloud. Then the hills on the horizon shifted, not the way hills shift in a heat haze. This was a slow, deliberate sliding, soil and rock folding like fabric. You could see the line of trees bending with them, each one tilting the same way, as if bowing to something unseen. From that distance, it looked like the land was breathing harder than before. Then it exhaled. The air hit Millford like a wave. Thick, warm, and carrying a smell no one could name. Not rot, not smoke. Something older, something that made teeth ache and bones feel heavy. Those who'd been to Cedar Ridge recognized it instantly. The bells grew louder, not carried on the wind, there was no wind, but from everywhere at once, the sound vibrating in the ground, in the walls, in the hollows of your chest. And then, the chapel rose. It didn't lift from the earth. The earth lifted with it. Foundations, cobblestones, fences, whole swaths of frozen soil, all coming up in one slow motion, as though the chapel was the head of something buried deep. In Cedar Ridge, no one moved. The chosen stood in neat rows facing outward, eyes black, hands at their sides. The brothers stood at the chapel's threshold, each one taller than the steeple had been the year before. Dr. Morrison, watching from the second-floor window of what had once been his clinic, finally understood. The shaping wasn't about control, it wasn't about faith. It was about making the town part of a body, a structure that could support weight, channel power, move. The streets weren't streets, they were veins. The wells weren't wells, they were inlets. The chosen weren't followers, they were nerves carrying messages between the thing's heart and mind. The chapel was its skull, the brothers were its voice. The first step was almost gentle, the ground rolled underfoot, building swaying but not falling. Then came another, and another. Millford saw the gap between them shrink. With each step, the sky above Cedar Ridge shifted, colors blooming and fading like bruises, clouds moving against the wind. Time seemed to warp around the edges of the thing. A sunrise bled into sunset in seconds. The bells grew deafening. In Millford, people tried to run, but the roads were already wrong. The same curves, the same folding paths that had trapped Cedar Ridge were uncoiling now, reaching outward. Something vast was coming for them. Not quickly, not hungrily, but inevitably, like a tide returning to shore. And as the shape rose higher from the earth, its outline no longer matched the map of the hills. It was taller than the trees, broader than the valley. Its surface was made of streets and rooftops and windows that blinked like eyes. Cedar Ridge had stopped pretending to be a town. Now it was awake, and it was looking for more. They tried fire first. Millford's remaining men, 30 in all, gathered everything that would burn: kerosene, dry hay, even old furniture hacked into kindling. They waited until Cedar Ridge's shape loomed closest, the chapel towering high enough that its steeple brushed low clouds. Then they lit the fields. The flames rose quick and hot, but the smoke went the wrong way, drawn inward toward the thing's moving bulk, curling into vents between buildings like breath sucked through teeth. Within minutes, the fire dimmed, its embers falling to the earth like dead stars. Then the bells rang again. Not the deep toll from before. This was faster, sharper, a rhythm like a heartbeat pushing through the ground. Each note carried a pressure that made ears bleed. The chosen began to walk out from Cedar Ridge's base, fanning across the blackened fields in perfect lines. Millford had guns, and they used them. The first volley tore into the front rank of chosen, but none fell. They kept walking, holes in their coats closing as if stitched by invisible hands. One by one, the gunmen stopped firing, either from fear or from the growing realization that the figures approaching weren't slowing. Dr. Morrison had not joined the defense. He'd been working in secret for weeks, mapping the pulses he felt under Cedar Ridge's ground, the strange tides in the air. He believed he'd found the thing's heart, a point deep in the chapel floor where the pressure was strongest. His theory was simple: if you destroyed the heart, you killed the body. But to reach it, you had to get inside. When the chosen reached the edge of Millford, Morrison made his move. Alone, he slipped through the warped roads, letting them fold and twist, trusting his notes to guide him toward the chapel. The streets shifted around him, but for the first time they seemed to allow his passage, as though curious. Inside, the brothers waited. All four stood over the spot Morrison had marked on his map. The floor wasn't wood anymore. It was a translucent membrane pulsing in time with the bells. Something enormous moved beneath it, slow and deliberate. Morrison raised the bundle in his arms. 6 sticks of dynamite lashed together, fuse already lit. Ezra smiled. "You've come to kill us." Morrison stepped forward. "Not you. What you serve." Jonah tilted his head. You think we serve it? The floor split open, not breaking, opening like a mouth. Heat and wind rushed upward, nearly tearing the dynamite from Morrison's hands. In the depths, he saw something that might have been an eye, and it was looking directly at him. He threw the bundle. The explosion tore through the chapel, shattering the steeple, cracking the ground. The brothers did not fall, but the thing beneath them shuddered. The hills around Cedar Ridge froze mid-step. The bells stopped. When the smoke cleared, the chapel was gone. So was Dr. Morrison. But the next morning, the ground under Millford shifted just once like a breath, and everyone knew the thing was only sleeping. 23 years later, no one in Millford spoke of Cedar Ridge. The land where the town once stood was listed as uninhabitable on government maps, though no one ever explained why. The hills had grown over with thick, impassable forest. Roads were abandoned. The only visitors were the occasional group of thrill-seeking hikers who ignored the warnings never to return. Local children learned early not to say the town's name. Those who did sometimes woke in the night to find black cloth braided into their hair. In the summer of the 23rd year, a survey crew came to mark boundaries for a new rail line. There were 6 of them, men and women from far-off cities who laughed at the superstitions of small towns. They pitched camp at the base of the ridge. On the first night, the forest went silent. By the second, one of the crew was missing. They found her boots neatly placed outside her tent, the laces tied in knots they couldn't undo. Her footprints led into the trees, but there were no signs of her coming back. On the third night, the bells returned. The crew swore later that they didn't hear them so much as feel them, deep in their ribs, behind their eyes. The sound carried no direction, yet every step they took brought them closer to it. The forest rearranged itself, paths bending subtly until the trees thinned and the ground began to slope downward. They found the chapel. It was smaller than it should have been, almost no bigger than a shack, but the steeple stretched impossibly high into the clouds. The walls shimmered as though underwater, and there were figures inside. 4 of them. The brothers had not aged a day. One of the surveyors, a man named Keats, managed to stagger back to Millford weeks later, clothes torn, hair gone white. He wouldn't speak about what he'd seen except to say, "It's not sleeping anymore. It's listening." After that, hills began to shift again, not enough to draw notice from the outside world, but enough that Millford's oldest residents recognized the signs. The roads will start to fold soon, the air will grow heavy, the chosen will walk again. And this time when Cedar Ridge moves, there will be no Dr. Morrison to stop it. Keats didn't last the week. The day after he stumbled into Millford, the sheriff found him sitting in the middle of Main Street at dawn, staring toward the western hills. His lips moved constantly, forming words no one recognized, syllables that didn't belong to any language spoken here. By sundown, his voice was gone. On the 7th night, he walked barefoot into the river and kept walking until the water swallowed him. That was when the dreams began. At first, only a few townsfolk reported them. A chapel door standing open, a black road unspooling toward it, the sound of bells under the skin. But by the end of the month, everyone in Millford had dreamed it at least once. Children started waking up with dirt under their nails. Livestock wouldn't go near the west fields. Horses would rear and bolt if pointed in that direction. Even the dogs stayed inside after sunset, pacing and whining until dawn. Sheriff Harlan gathered the oldest residents in the town hall. They spoke in low voices about the last time the bells had come, about the ground shifting, about the chosen walking in lines. None of them wanted to believe it was happening again, but they all remembered the way it ended, and they all remembered Dr. Morrison. But Morrison had been gone for more than 2 decades, and no one had his maps, his notes, or his strange, stubborn confidence. 2 nights later, a boy named Tommy Carver disappeared. His parents found his bed neatly made, his boots missing, and the back door wide open. There were no footprints in the frost, just a faint line in the grass leading toward the ridge. By morning, the hills looked closer. The sheriff rode out to check for himself. He didn't come back. That evening, the ground beneath Millford trembled once, just enough to rattle windows and send dust from the rafters. Then came the faintest echo of bells, not loud, not yet, but steady, as if marking time. Whatever was in Cedar Ridge was moving again, and this time it wasn't waiting 23 years to arrive. The bells grew louder each night. Not enough to drown out conversation yet, but enough that people began speaking softer, as though raising their voices might draw attention. On the third night after the sheriff vanished, the roads west of town started to warp. It was subtle at first, a fence line that didn't quite match where it had always been, a field that seemed to slope differently. By dawn, travelers found themselves circling back to Millford no matter which direction they took. Then the chosen appeared. They came at dusk, 20 of them walking in a line down Main Street. Their clothes were clean, their hair neatly combed, but their eyes were as black as the night sky. They didn't speak, they didn't stumble, they simply passed through, their heads turning in unison to study each house. No one dared step outside. The next morning, 4 families were gone. Beds made, doors locked, no sign of a struggle. By the end of the week, the chosen were coming in greater numbers. They no longer traveled in a single file line. They moved in groups, splitting at the town square, covering more ground. Some carried bundles wrapped in cloth. No one wanted to know what was inside. It wasn't just Millford anymore. Reports came in from Bracken Hollow, nearly 20 miles away. Folks there claimed their own missing, their own dreams of the Black Road and the open chapel door. The pattern was spreading in widening arcs from Cedar Ridge, as if the thing beneath it had grown, its reach no longer confined to the valley. Old Mrs. Dunbar, who had been a girl during the first awakening, said the worst thing she remembered wasn't the ground moving, it was the moment you realized you couldn't leave. "The land bends for it," she whispered to the gathered crowd in the town hall, "and once it bends, you belong to it." On the 10th night, the ground under Millford shivered, not a gentle remor this time, but a deep, rolling motion that knocked books from shelves and sent lanterns swinging. Somewhere to the west, a deep cracking sound split the air. The hills had taken another step, and between each step the bells rang once like a clock counting down. By the 12th night, no one in Millford could pretend anymore. The horizon to the west was wrong. The ridgeline was higher than it had been a week before, and the silhouettes of Cedar Ridge's buildings, sharp against the setting sun, were closer than memory said they should be. The chapel steeple now cut the sky like a knife. It wasn't just moving, it was moving faster. Men climbed the church roof in town to get a better look, but they came down pale and shaking. From that height, you could see the ground between the hills and Millford rippling, as if something enormous was pushing upward from below. The chosen no longer walked in silence. Now they carried lanterns, their lights swinging like fireflies as they fanned across the valley. They didn't speak words, but the hum they made, low, constant, matched the rhythm of the bells. Each night, more people vanished. On the 14th night, a fog rolled in, thick enough to erase the edges of the world. When it lifted at dawn, Cedar Ridge was close enough that you could see cracks in its walls and movement in its windows. The chapel doors stood open, and even at that distance the black inside was visible, black that seemed deeper than shadow. That same morning, a sound came from beneath the earth. Not the sharp ring of the bells, but something longer, wetter, like breath being drawn through stone. It lasted nearly a minute, and when it stopped, every window in Millford rattled. Mrs. Dunbar was the first to say what everyone was thinking. "It's hungry this time." The council met that night in the schoolhouse, the only building with a basement. Arguments flew. Some wanted to flee east, others wanted to barricade the town. But the old roads already bent back toward Millford, and the chosen had begun standing in pairs along the outskirts, lanterns held high like sentries marking territory. Then came the 13th toll of the bells. It shook the rafters and drove everyone to their knees. And for the first time since it began, the sound didn't fade when it finished. It stayed, ringing low in the bones of every living thing. That was when they realized Cedar Ridge would reach Millford in days, not weeks, and there was nowhere left to run. The siege began without warning. At dawn, the bells rang twice in quick succession, short, sharp notes that rattled the teeth. By the time the sun rose high enough to burn off the morning haze, the Chosen had filled every road leading into Millford. They didn't attack, they simply stood, shoulder to shoulder, their faces expressionless, their lanterns swaying. The air between the town and the horizon shimmered like heat over a desert road, though the day was cold. Then the ground began to change. At first it was just a softening beneath the boots, dirt that sank a little too far, grass that felt slick to the touch. But soon the streets themselves began to shift. Cobblestones stretched and buckled, pulling into curves where none had been before, houses tilted slightly, as if the foundations were melting. By midday, people could see Cedar Ridge clearly. It was no longer a distant cluster of buildings. It loomed behind the Chosen like a living wall. The chapel had grown impossibly tall, its steeple bending slightly forward, almost like it was listening. The buildings around it seemed to pulse, their windows opening and closing in slow, uneven intervals. Mrs. Dunbar collapsed in the square when she saw it. Between gasps, she whispered a single phrase, "It's bringing itself here, piece by piece." That night, the Chosen entered the town. They didn't break down doors, they opened them politely one by one. They stepped inside homes and returned minutes later carrying bundles. Sometimes the bundles shifted, sometimes they didn't. No one dared ask. A few tried to resist. A group of men on the east side gathered rifles and opened fire on a cluster of Chosen. The bullets hit, but instead of falling, the Chosen only turned, calmly walking toward the shooters. By the time the rest of the town reached the street, the men were gone. The bells rang again, 4 deep, slow notes. As the air thickened until it felt like breathing syrup, lantern flames sputtered, yet the light from Cedar Ridge's chapel grew brighter, stretching in long, unnatural beams across the valley. And then, sometime past midnight, the ground under Millford tilted. Not enough to throw anyone off their feet, but enough to feel the town sliding slowly towards Cedar Ridge. By morning, the horizon was gone. The hills had folded inward, and Cedar Ridge stood just beyond the last row of houses. It had come for them. The morning Cedar Ridge touched Millford, the sky turned the color of ash. No wind blew, no birds called. Even the river stopped moving, its surface flat as glass. The Chosen no longer carried lanterns, now they walked empty-handed, their arms at their sides, eyes locked on the chapel. The steeple loomed over the town, casting a shadow that stretched too far, bending around corners and slipping through windows. Then the bells rang 13 times. With each toll, the ground shook, and the buildings of Millford leaned toward the west. The air grew heavier, pressing down until people were forced to their knees. Doors swung open on their own, floors tilted toward the chapel. From its doorway came something that was not a man. It wore the shape of one, tall and thin, but its face was a blur, shifting too quickly to see. Every time the bells struck, the blur slowed just enough for a mouth to open and breathe a single word that was not meant for human ears. Those who heard it dropped where they stood, eyes wide, lips moving silently. The Chosen moved through the streets, guiding the living toward the chapel. Some resisted. They were carried anyway. Inside, there was no floor, only blackness that seemed to breathe. The walls pulsed like veins, and far below, something vast stirred, as if Cedar Ridge was just the skin of a deeper thing that had finally risen to feed. By sunset, Millford was empty. The chapel doors closed, the bells stopped. When the sun rose again, there was no trace of Millford, only a wide, grassy plain where the town had been, and far to the west, Cedar Ridge standing quietly, its steeple once again distant. And in the towns beyond the valley, the dreams began. A road, an open door, bells under the skin,